The last light of evening stretched across the quiet valley of North Wales, painting the room in a muted wash of gray and fading gold. At 78, Timothy Dalton sat beside a window framed by heavy drapes, the kind that soften sound and gather silence. His hands rested loosely on the worn armrest, fingers tracing a pattern he seemed to recognize from another lifetime. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees with the gentlest insistence, as if urging him to finally release something he had held too tightly for too long. For decades, Dalton had been the embodiment of restraint, the man whose stillness spoke louder than dialogue, whose eyes carried storms beneath surfaces of iron composure. Audiences saw intensity, elegance, mystery. Few ever saw the fractures. Fewer still knew how deeply certain wounds had carved into him. When he exhaled, the sound was almost imperceptible. When he finally spoke, the room seemed to listen. "There are 5 people," he murmured, "that I will never forgive." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. There was something chillingly honest in the way he said it, as if these names had lived beneath his ribs for years, etched into him like an old scar that never softened. His gaze drifted toward the distant hills, shadowed under the last trace of light. "Some betrayal," he whispered, "stay with you long after the world has forgotten them. 5 faces, 5 stories, 5 wounds that time never managed to close." But who were they? And why, after a lifetime of silence, did these memories still burn through him like embers refusing to die out? Long before the world knew him as the brooding force of stage and screen, Timothy Dalton was a quiet boy growing up in the shifting landscapes of post-war England. Born in Colwyn Bay and later raised in Derbyshire, his childhood unfolded between rolling green fields, small-town restraint, and the lingering echoes of a country still learning how to breathe again. There was beauty in those early years, but also a kind of emotional distance that shaped him far more than he understood at the time. His father, a grounded man shaped by military discipline, believed in strength, order, and silence. His mother, warm but often overwhelmed, worked tirelessly to keep the household steady. Dalton, the eldest, learned early how to read the room, how to interpret the subtle tightening of a jaw, the quiet exhaustion behind a smile. He inherited discipline from one parent, sensitivity from the other, and carried both as if they were fragile glass. He was not loud, not rebellious, but he felt deeply, painfully deeply, in ways he could not voice. School offered little refuge. He was bright, introspective, and noticeably different in a world that rewarded boys who moved loudly through life. Yet he found pockets of solace, books, long walks alone, and eventually the stage. A school production, modest, clumsy, nearly forgotten by everyone else, changed him. Under the dim lights of that tiny auditorium, he discovered something that felt like truth. Acting wasn't performance, it was release. It was the first space where he didn't need to restrain his emotions. He could finally let them breathe. But the origins of his gift were intertwined with the origins of his pain. Dalton grew older, carrying bruises no one saw. The pressure of responsibility, the quiet fear of disappointing his father, the sensitivity he learned to hide, and the loneliness that followed him through adolescence. He stepped into adulthood with the posture of someone strong, but with the heart of someone who had learned to protect himself early. Too early. These early wounds, subtle, silent, deeply embedded, became the foundation for the man he would become, and the very vulnerabilities that certain people would later exploit, leaving scars he would never forgive. Timothy Dalton's rise was not a dazzling leap into fame, but a slow, deliberate unfolding. The emergence of a man shaped by discipline, solitude, and a quiet emotional depth that would later define his greatest roles. When he entered the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, he carried none of the flamboyance or bravado often associated with young actors. He moved with stillness, listened more than he spoke, and seemed to observe every room with the intensity of someone who had learned early that silence could be a form of protection. His instructors noticed something unusual. Dalton possessed a kind of emotional restraint that made his performances feel both controlled and explosive. He didn't transform into characters. He stepped into them as if unlocking a hidden door within himself. His eyes carried the weight of unspoken stories, His voice trembled with carefully concealed storms, and his posture suggested a man always balancing strength with vulnerability. Even in the smallest scenes, he drew attention effortlessly. The stage became his first home, a place where he could release everything he had spent his childhood tightening inside his chest. Shakespeare especially felt like a language he had always known. Hamlet's internal battles, Macbeth's collapsing certainty, and Romeo's fragile passion all echoed pieces of his own emotional history. Audiences felt him rather than simply watched him, sensing that every moment he spent under the lights cost him something real. His work with the Royal Shakespeare Company elevated him from promising young actor to undeniable force. Critics spoke of his depth. Directors marveled at his discipline. Yet Dalton carried a quiet discomfort with attention, uneasy with praise that seemed to graze too close to the parts of himself he preferred to keep hidden. Hollywood eventually called, drawn by the gravity he projected even in silence. The offer to play James Bond was both an opportunity and a threat, an invitation to step into the shoes of a global icon while wrestling with the knowledge that fame demanded a version of himself he had never been entirely comfortable revealing. His Bond was unlike any before, brooding, wounded, shaped by moral weight rather than charm. For some it was a revelation, for others a departure. Dalton accepted both reactions with familiar restraint, though privately the pressure wore on him. The spotlight magnified insecurities he had never resolved, and the expectations of the role tightened around him, like armor he could not remove. After Bond, his performances deepened, as if the experience had peeled something open inside him. Roles in Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and The Line in Winter revealed a man able to articulate sorrow, longing, and complexity with devastating authenticity. But with each success came quieter fractures, shifting loyalties, personal disappointments, and emotional vulnerabilities he rarely voiced. His rise was magnificent, yes, but beneath it lived the early beginnings of the 5 betrayals he would never forget. The ruptures in Timothy Dalton's life did not arrive like thunder. They appeared quietly, gradually, the way cracks begin inside old stone, invisible at first, then widening until the structure can no longer pretend to be whole. By the time Dalton reached the height of his fame, these fractures had already begun shaping the man behind the roles. The first rupture came in the form of a professional betrayal he never saw coming. A mentor he had trusted, as someone whose approval once meant everything to him, used Dalton's vulnerability as leverage. Praise offered in private became criticism whispered in the right circles, and opportunities that should have lifted him were redirected through quieter, more calculated hands. It was a painful awakening, the realization that admiration can disguise ambition, and that even guidance can carry a hidden blade. The second rupture was more intimate. Dalton, who loved cautiously, once allowed himself to fall deeply for someone who seemed to understand the silence he lived in. But the relationship fractured under the weight of expectations neither of them knew how to articulate. What hurt most was not the ending, but the slow unraveling before it, the shift in tone, the growing distance, the unspoken disappointment that hung in every room they shared. Some heartbreaks, he would say later, happened long before the goodbye. Then came the rupture that shook him professionally. A colleague he considered a friend used his trust to gain advantage during a negotiation, revealing private doubts Dalton had shared in confidence. It wasn't loud betrayal. It was silent, precise, and devastating. For a man who valued loyalty above praise, it left a wound far deeper than any public criticism ever could. A fourth rupture emerged within his family. A misunderstanding, left unresolved for years, created a chasm that neither side was brave enough to close. Dalton buried that pain beneath the busyness of work, but it lived in him like a bruise that never fully healed. These ruptures did not break him in grand, dramatic ways. They chipped at him quietly, softly, persistently. And from the pieces that fell away, the faces of the 5 people he would never forgive began to take shape. 5 betrayals that would define the darkest corners of his memory. When Timothy Dalton, at 78, finally allowed himself to speak of the 5 people he will never forgive, he did so without anger, without theatrics, and without the hard edge of bitterness. His voice was steady. the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying quiet wounds that few ever knew existed. "Forgiveness," he said softly, "is not something I deny others. It is something I no longer force myself to give." And then he named them, not aloud but inside himself. The 5 people whose betrayals shaped him in ways neither fame nor time could erase. The mentor who dismantled his confidence. In his early 20s, Dalton looked up to a man who seemed to hold the keys to an entire world of possibility. This mentor saw his talent immediately, praised him relentlessly, and offered guidance that felt like destiny. But admiration turned into control. Compliments became critiques disguised as wisdom. Every achievement was followed by a subtle reminder of what he lacked. For years, Dalton believed that his worth hinged on this man's approval. Only later, too late, did he realize that he had been shaped to remain dependent, not to rise. "I cannot forgive him," Dalton said quietly, "because he taught me to mistrust my own instincts." The friend who let envy corrode affection. They met early in their careers, 2 young actors surviving London's harsh theater circuit together. They shared dreams, fears, auditions, heartbreaks. Dalton believed this friendship would last his entire life. But when Dalton's career soared faster, small cracks appeared, jokes that landed too sharply, praise that sounded hollow, distance that felt rehearsed. The betrayal came when Dalton discovered his friend had been belittling him to others, not out of malice, but out of envy. "Jealousy," Dalton said, "is a shadow that pretends to be friendship." The love who left without warning. Dalton loved rarely, but when he did, he loved fully, with patience, with attentiveness, with a sincerity few ever saw. There was one love in particular, a partner who seemed to understand the quiet spaces inside him. For a time, Dalton allowed himself to believe he could finally be known without needing to explain. But love, he learned, can lose its balance quietly. Affection cooled. Presence became absence. Words once tender became cautious. And then one morning, without drama or cruelty, Dalton was left with nothing but a brief explanation and a hollow room. "I don't resent the leaving," he said. "I resent the silence that came before it." It was a wound shaped not by loss, but by the slow suffocation of unspoken truths. The colleague who weaponized his vulnerability. Dalton had always been careful about trust, but once on a film set, he allowed himself to open up to a colleague he believed shared his dedication and respect for the craft. He confided in him, his doubts, his pressures, his fear of failing those who admired him. That colleague later used those confessions during a moment of public disagreement, turning Dalton's vulnerability into ammunition. It was so subtle, so expertly delivered, that others barely noticed the cruelty. But Dalton felt it, a coldness sharper than any insult. "To betray trust quietly," he said, "is far more brutal than doing it loudly." Himself, the betrayal he carries most heavily. The final name was the one he spoke last, and the one he struggled to say at all. "The 5th person," he whispered, "is me." Not the actor, not the public figure, but the man who lived beneath the roles, the man who remained silent when he should have fought, the man who held back out of fear instead of desire, the man who let doubt dictate choices that should have been guided by instinct, the man who trusted too long and distrusted too late. "I forgave everyone else before I forgave myself," he said. "I am still learning how." This betrayal was not a single event, but a lifetime of moments where he abandoned his own needs for the sake of peace, stability, or expectation. And even now, in his late years, it is the wound that continues to ache the most. These 5 betrayals, some loud, some silent, all unforgettable, shaped the man behind the legend. They did not harden him. They deepened him. They carved wisdom into him. They illuminated his strength. And in speaking them now, he is not reopening old wounds. He is finally, gently setting them down. At 78, Timothy Dalton now moves through life with the quiet assurance of someone who has survived storms no one else ever saw. His home, tucked among the peaceful hills, softened by time and memory, feels less like a retreat and more like a sanctuary he has spent decades learning how to enter. The walls hold photographs, scripts marked with fading ink, and relics from a career built on discipline rather than noise. But the most remarkable thing in the house is the silence. A silence no longer heavy, no longer sharp, but finally gentle. In that silence, he has learned the full truth of his own heart. He no longer revisits the 5 betrayals with bitterness. He revisits them with understanding. Each of the 4 who hurt him played a role in shaping the kind of man he ultimately became. Someone stronger, more perceptive, more compassionate than he might have been without those wounds. And the 5th, the betrayal he carried from himself, remains the most difficult, but also the most necessary. Age has given him something youth denied, the chance to meet the man he once feared he was, and to offer him the grace he never knew how to accept. I don't speak of forgiveness, he said softly, as a gift to others. I speak of it as a doorway I am finally brave enough to walk through. He does not want revenge. He does not want apologies. He wants peace, and he is finally close enough to touch it. And now, as dust settles gently across his world, we are left to wonder, what becomes of the wounds we carry when we finally stop running from them? And who might we become if we dared to forgive ourselves at last?